October 1845. Nauvoo, Illinois. The autumn air is turning crisp along the wide, sweeping bend of the Mississippi River. The temple on the hill stands nearly finished, its massive limestone walls pale against the gray, low-hanging sky, but the city itself is quiet with a heavy, restless anticipation that none can ignore. The saints know their time here is short. The city charter has been repealed. The surrounding settlements are openly hostile, and the sound of wagons being built echoes from nearly every barn, shop, and backyard. Inside a small, drafty room of a modest frame home, 41-year-old Eliza Roxy Snow sits before a simple wooden table. The room is sparse, smelling of dry wood smoke and the damp earth of late autumn. She dips a steel-nibbed pen into a well of dark ink, her hand remarkably steady despite the chill in the air and the looming dark shadow of impending exile. She is a woman who has already lost almost everything that the world deems secure. She has lost her home in Ohio. She has lost her sanctuary in Missouri. And, just 16 months earlier, her husband, the prophet Joseph Smith, was murdered in Carthage jail, leaving an ache that still hangs like a physical shroud over the entire city of Joseph. Yet, as she sits in the fading light of this afternoon, she does not write of despair, nor does she pen a lamentation about the bitterness of their imminent departure into the western wilderness. Instead, she writes of home, not of Nauvoo, and not of the distant, rocky valleys they will soon have to seek, but of a home that existed long before the foundations of this earth were ever laid. Her pen moves deliberately across the paper, tracing lines that will eventually be known, sung, and cherished by millions of people across generations she will never see. She writes, "O my Father, thou that dwellest in the high and glorious place, when shall I regain thy presence and again behold thy face?" She is not merely composing a pleasant poem to pass the long, anxious hours of a Nauvoo autumn evening. She is translating the vast, revolutionary, and consoling doctrines of the Restoration into a language that can be sung, remembered, and carried in the hearts of a fleeing people. In this quiet room, while the distant hammers of wagon makers strike iron against wood, Eliza is performing an act of quiet defiance against time, loss, and mortality. She is taking the private teachings of Joseph Smith, the grand, eternal truths of a premortal existence, of our divine parentage, and of the eternal structure of the family, and she is sealing them into language. She does not own a printing press. She has no wealth, no political power, and no guarantee that these words will ever be read outside of a few close friends in Illinois, or that the fragile sheet of paper she writes upon will survive the hazardous journey across the frozen Mississippi and into the trackless plains. She writes because she must. She writes because she has received a witness, and she knows with a quiet, burning certainty that a witness unrecorded is a gift returned to the giver unopened. Her ink is her monument, her paper her temple, and she works with the patience of someone who knows that God's time is not measured by the rise and fall of cities. It is easy to look back at Eliza R. Snow through the gilded, reverent frame of LDS history and see only the prominent, powerful figure she eventually became, the sister of a prophet, the wife of prophets, the general president of the Relief Society, and the celebrated sweet singer of Israel. But in that cold October of 1845, she was simply a woman with a pen, facing an incredibly uncertain, dangerous future with nothing but her covenants and her personal testimony to sustain her. You may find yourself sitting in a very similar quiet room today, looking out at a world that seems increasingly distant from the truths you have spent your entire life defending. You may have reached a season in your life where your own voice feels thin, where your children or grandchildren seem entirely indifferent to the faith that has been your anchor, and where the values you labored for decades to instill in them are treated as mere relics of a bygone, simpler era. You ask yourself, in the quiet, lonely spaces of your heart, if any of it has actually mattered. You wonder if the testimonies you bore in hot, crowded fast meetings, the prayers you offered over sleeping children in the dead of night, the journals you filled with steady devotion, or the quiet examples of endurance you showed through decades of personal trial will simply fade into the background noise of history, unremembered, unheeded, and lost. The weight of this silent question can be heavier than the physical infirmities that come with aging. It is the deep, subtle fear that your life's witness will be lost in transition, that when you pass from this life, The chain of faith you fought so hard to maintain and strengthen will break at the very link you occupied. You look at your family, or at the rapidly changing moral landscape of the world around you, and you feel a profound, aching sense of limitation. You cannot force those you love to see the light you have seen, or to feel the burning conviction you have felt. You cannot control whether they choose to read your journals, keep your letters, or remember the quiet moments of spiritual clarity that defined your life's journey. In this space of limitation, the adversary whispers that your silence is just as well, that you should keep your thoughts to yourself, that your words no longer fit the modern tongue, and that the effort to bear witness is a waste of your dwindling store of energy. But the pattern of the restoration and the long, faithful life of Eliza R. Snow suggests something entirely different. It reminds us that we do not write, speak, or live our testimonies because we can guarantee how they will be received by our contemporaries. We do so because the act of witness is itself a holy office, a sacred covenant offering that God can preserve, reshape, and deliver to hearts we may never meet in this life, long after our own voices have fallen silent. To understand the depth and power of Eliza's voice, one must understand the crucible of trial and sacrifice in which it was formed. Born in Massachusetts in 1804 and raised in the fertile lands of Ohio, she was a young woman of exceptionally sharp intellect, deep literary sensitivity, and a quiet, highly observant nature. Long before she ever heard the name of Joseph Smith or knew anything of the Book of Mormon, she was recognized locally for her poetic talents, often writing on patriotic, social, and national themes for newspapers in Ohio. When her family embraced the restored gospel in the mid-1830s, Eliza did not merely accept a new set of religious ideas. She entered into a covenant relationship with the Lord that completely transformed her talent from a social ornament into a prophetic, documentary instrument. She moved to Kirtland, Ohio in 1835, where she boarded with the family of Joseph Smith, taught school in his home, and began her lifelong, self-appointed work of documenting the history, the trials, and the spiritual triumphs of the early saints. She was there when the Kirtland Temple was dedicated, witnessing firsthand the Pentecostal outpourings of the Spirit, the visions of angels, and the keys restored by ancient prophets that marked the early days of the Restoration. But she was also there when the dark, suffocating clouds of apostasy, financial ruin, and bitter betrayal descended upon the church, forcing her to flee with her family in the dead of night to the state of Missouri. In Missouri, she saw the raw, violent edge of religious persecution in all its horror. She was at Far West when the state's governor issued the infamous extermination order. She watched as her people were plundered of their earthly goods, her friends and leaders imprisoned in dark dungeons, and her home taken from her by lawless mobs. During the bitter, freezing winter of 1838 and 1839, she walked across the frozen mud and ice of Missouri to the safety of Illinois, carrying with her only what could fit in a single wagon. In those dark, grueling miles, when many fell away from the church, cursed the path they had chosen, or succumbed to despair, Eliza did not lose her voice. Instead, her poetry became sharper, more resilient, and more deeply focused on the eternal, invisible reality behind the temporal suffering. She wrote to comfort the mothers who had lost babies to exposure. She wrote to defend the character of the persecuted. She wrote to record the names of those who stood true when everything else failed. By the time she arrived in the swampy, fever-ridden bend of the river that would become Nauvoo, she had learned a hard but essential truth of discipleship. The world could strip her of her property, her health, and her physical security, but it could never strip her of her testimony unless she chose to yield it. Her pen became her shield and her sword. When the Female Relief Society of Nauvoo was organized in March of 1842, Joseph Smith turned to Eliza to be its secretary, knowing she was a woman who could be trusted not just to keep sterile minutes, but to capture the very spirit of a movement that would span generations. There is a profound, beautiful theological reason why the Lord has always commanded His covenant people to write down their history and their testimonies. From the very beginning of human history, when Adam was commanded by God to keep a book of remembrance, the act of writing has been treated not as a secular administrative task, but as a saving, sacred ordinance of remembrance. In the Book of Mormon, we read of prophets who labored with great physical difficulty to engrave their words on plates of brass and gold, not because it was easy, convenient, or socially rewarding, but because they knew with absolute certainty that without a written record, their descendants would eventually dwindle in unbelief, forgetting the covenants of their fathers. The written word has a unique, almost miraculous capacity to transcend the limitations of human mortality. It survives the death of the hand that wrote it. It outlasts the changing fashions, philosophies, and languages of the age. It remains quiet, patient, and still in a drawer, a closet, or an archive, waiting for the precise moment when a seeking, broken soul is ready to find it. Eliza R. Snow understood this covenantal duty of record-keeping with her entire soul. She knew that her poetry was not just a collection of pleasant, rhythmic verses designed to entertain, but a formal, legal witness of the truths that had been revealed through the prophet Joseph Smith. When we write down our testimonies today, or when we speak them aloud in the hearing of our families, our ward members, and our neighbors, we are participating in this same ancient, covenantal labor of remembrance. We are creating a permanent record that stands as a witness against the gathering darkness of the world. It is easy to think that because your children or grandchildren do not seem interested in your testimony today, it will never have value to them in the future. But the human heart is not a static, unyielding thing. A child who is indifferent or even hostile to the gospel of Jesus Christ at age 25 may find themselves at 45 sitting in a quiet, lonely room of their own, facing a sudden crisis of faith, a devastating loss, or a deep sorrow that their modern philosophies and worldly achievements cannot heal. In that exact hour, a forgotten letter from a grandmother, a passage in a grandfather's journal, or even the memory of a steady, unwavering testimony spoken years before can rise up from the past like a voice from the dust. It can provide the very anchor, the very spark of light they need to find their way back to the covenant path. We do not write for the audience we have today. We write for the generations we may never live to see in mortality. We write because the Lord has commanded us to leave a trail of light behind us, so that those who follow will know that someone walked this difficult path before them and found it to be true. The hymn we now sing as O My Father was originally published under the title My Father in Heaven in the Nauvoo Neighbor in October of 1845, just as the saints were preparing to leave their homes forever. It is a masterpiece of theological concentration, compressing the vast, eternal scope of the plan of salvation into just 4 brief, elegant stanzas. She begins with the premortal life, establishing our identity not as cosmic accidents or creations of nothing, but as literal children of God who once dwelt in His high and glorious presence. She then moves directly to the mortal condition, describing this life as a necessary exile, a temporary school where we must walk by faith, carrying with us a dim, subconscious memory of our former, heavenly home. In the 3rd stanza, she addresses the grand, revolutionary question that had puzzled Christian theologians for centuries: the nature of our divine parentage. She wrote, I had learned to call thee Father, through thy Spirit from on high, but until the key of knowledge was restored, I knew not why. In the heatheness are parents single? No, the thought makes reason stare. Truth is reason. Truth eternal tells me I've a mother there. This was the first formal, public articulation of the doctrine of a heavenly mother in the history of the restored Church of Jesus Christ. While Joseph Smith had taught this sublime truth in private settings to close, trusted associates, it was Eliza's poetic genius that gave it a beautiful, accessible form that could be easily internalized, remembered, and treasured by the general body of the saints. She did not present this doctrine as a complex, academic theological argument or a dry, administrative decree. She presented it as a matter of simple, beautiful truth that resonated with the deepest, most sacred instincts of the human soul. By setting this truth to the music of a familiar, comforting tune, she made it portable and indestructible. The saints could sing it as they walked beside their slow-moving wagons across the dusty plains of Nebraska. They could sing it as they laid their beloved infants to rest in unmarked graves along the trail. They could sing it in their humble log cabins in the isolated valleys of Utah. Eliza's words became the primary vehicle through which this grand truth was woven into the very fabric of LDS identity. She did not need a pulpit to teach the doctrine of divine parentage. She needed only to put the truth into words that could be sung, and those words outlasted the generations of those who tried to silence her. The years following the departure from Nauvoo were a long, exhausting, and seemingly endless test of Eliza's endurance, patience, and faith. She was not spared the physical suffering, illness, and deprivation that came with the pioneer exodus. In her trail journals, she recorded with remarkable detail the misery of rain-soaked camps, the constant lack of adequate food, and the heavy toll of illness that swept through the wagons, leaving graves at every stopping point. She herself was often dangerously ill, suffering from a severe, painful form of arthritis that made every step a physical trial of endurance. Yet, even when her body was weak and her physical surroundings were bleak and discouraging, her spirit remained entirely undiminished. She continued to write. She wrote poems to celebrate the birthdays of her friends in the mud of Iowa. She wrote elegies for the children who died along the trail. She wrote songs of hope to keep the feet of the pioneers moving forward when their spirits flagged. She knew that in times of crisis, physical bread is not enough to sustain a people. They must also be fed with the bread of life, which is the word of God and the steady testimony of his servants. When the saints finally reached the Salt Lake Valley, her labor did not end. In many ways, it was only beginning. Eliza spent the next 4 decades of her life working tirelessly to establish the institutions and organizations that would define the church in the West. She was called by Brigham Young to travel throughout the vast territory, organizing relief societies, young ladies' mutual improvement associations, and primary organizations in every remote settlement. She traveled by wagon and carriage over rough, dusty, and dangerous roads, often sleeping in humble cabins and eating the simplest fare. She did not seek ease, comfort, or retirement as she aged. In her 60s, 70s, and 80s, she remained a constant, highly visible force among the saints, her presence serving as a living, breathing bridge to the foundational days of the Restoration. When people looked at Eliza R. Snow, they did not just see a leader. They saw an eyewitness to the glory of God. They saw someone who had known Joseph Smith intimately, who had stood in the Kirtland Temple, who had survived the mobs of Missouri, and who still carried the fire of that early witness in her eyes. Her life itself had become her greatest poem, written not in ink on paper, but in the quiet, daily decisions to serve, to endure, to hope, and to build. There is a unique, agonizing pain that comes to many older members of the church when they look back on their lives and feel that their testimonies have been lost on those they love most. You may have spent years serving in demanding callings, attending countless meetings, and trying with all your heart to create a home where the Spirit of the Lord could dwell, only to watch your children grow up and walk away from the covenants you cherish above life itself. You may feel a deep sense of failure, wondering if you did not speak clearly enough, or if your own imperfections and mistakes somehow obscured the beauty of the gospel in their eyes. You look at your journals sitting on a shelf, or your family history records in a dusty drawer, and you wonder if they will simply be thrown away, ignored, or forgotten when you are gone. The adversary wants you to believe that because your witness was not received with immediate joy and lasting commitment by your family, it was somehow invalid, useless, or a failure. He wants you to judge the value of your testimony by the immediate, visible reaction of your audience. But Eliza's life teaches us that the seed of testimony does not always germinate in the season it is planted, nor does it always grow in the way we expect. Eliza wrote many poems that were completely forgotten for decades, only to be rediscovered and deeply appreciated by later generations. She spoke to small, dusty congregations of women in remote, isolated Utah settlements, never knowing if her words were making any difference in the moment. The value of our testimony does not depend on whether others choose to accept it. Its value lies in its truth and in our faithfulness in offering it. When you bear your testimony, whether in a formal meeting, in a letter to a struggling child, or in a quiet conversation around the dinner table, you are performing a sacred, priestly duty. You are placing your witness on the altar of God. Once it is there, it is in His hands, and He has promised to watch over it. He knows how to preserve it, and He knows the precise, perfect moment when it can be used to touch a heart. Your responsibility is simply to offer it, to make sure that the truth you have received is not buried in silence. We must also recognize that our testimonies are not preserved only in the words we write, but in the lives we live. The way you carry yourself through the trials of aging, the way you handle physical pain, the loss of lifelong friends and spouse, and the gradual narrowing of your physical world, is a powerful, undeniable witness to those around you. Your children, your neighbors, and your friends are watching you, even when you think they are not paying attention. They notice the quiet, dignified steadiness with which you face the future. They see the absence of bitterness in your heart despite your trials. They hear the deep gratitude in your prayers. This consistent, faithful presence is a form of poetry that cannot be easily dismissed or forgotten. It is a living, breathing testimony that the covenants you made in your youth still have the power to sustain and comfort you in your old age. Eliza R. Snow was a woman of great, natural dignity, always dressed neatly and carrying herself with the bearing of a queen, even in the midst of the wilderness. She did not do this out of vanity or pride, but because she knew who she was, a daughter of God, a covenant keeper, and a witness of the restoration of all things. She understood that her physical appearance, her manners, and her daily interactions were all part of her witness of the gospel. You, too, have a dignity that comes from your covenants. When you choose to remain faithful, to continue attending your meetings when it is physically difficult, to serve others in whatever small, quiet ways you can, and to maintain a spirit of hope and optimism, you are writing a beautiful testimony on the hearts of those who observe you. This witness of a lived life is often far more difficult to ignore than any sermon or written document. It stands as a quiet, undeniable evidence of the reality of God's grace and the power of the restoration. In the economy of heaven, nothing of value is ever lost. The Lord does not keep records the way mortals do. He does not rely on bestseller lists, social media metrics, or the number of people who attend our funerals to determine the impact and worth of our lives. In the Doctrine and Covenants, the Lord revealed that there is a book kept in heaven, a book of life, in which the names of the faithful are written, along with a perfect record of their deeds, their testimonies, and their sacrifices. Every sincere prayer you have ever offered in secret, every quiet act of service you have performed without seeking recognition, and every testimony you have whispered in the ears of your children or written in your personal journal is recorded there, preserved in perfect clarity by Him who remembers all things and values every effort. This means that your witness is never truly unheard, unrecorded, or lost. Even if your journals are lost in a move, or if your children choose not to read them, the record of your faith remains entirely secure in the archives of eternity. And that record has a purpose that extends far beyond the brief span of this mortal sphere. In the resurrection, when we stand before the judgment seat of God, the books will be opened, and the reality of our lives will be made manifest. In that day, the testimony you bore in obscurity, the faithfulness you maintained in the face of indifference, and the quiet love you showed to those who rejected your faith will stand as a glorious witness of your devotion to Jesus Christ. Your words will have an eternal audience, even if they lacked a mortal one. You are writing for eternity, not just for the passing moment of this life, and your record is safe with Him. As we look back at Eliza R. Snow, sitting in her cold, sparse room in Nauvoo in the autumn of 1845, we can see the grand, deliberate design of the Lord in preserving her words. Today, her hymn, "O My Father," is sung in chapels all over the world, in dozens of different languages, by millions of saints who have found in her words a beautiful, perfect expression of their own deepest hopes and testimonies. She could not have foreseen this global impact as she dipped her pen in ink by the light of a single candle in an endangered city. She simply did what she was called to do in that hour. She bore witness of the truth she knew, using the talents she had been given, and trusted the Lord with the rest. You are called to do the same in your season of life. Do not let the silence of the world, or the indifference of those you love, discourage you from bearing your witness. Keep writing in your journals. Keep sending letters of love, faith, and encouragement to your family. Keep sharing your testimony whenever the opportunity arises. And, above all, keep living a life of quiet, steady faithfulness. You cannot predict which of your words, which of your actions, or which of your prayers will outlast you and become the anchor that saves a future generation. Trust the Lord with your legacy. He is the master of the record, and He knows how to make your witness endure. If you feel this desire in your heart today, I invite you to leave a simple statement of trust in the Lord in the comments below. A brief, sincere witness of your faith that will stand as a record of your devotion. Let us, like Eliza, put our testimonies into words and actions, trusting that the truths we have lived and loved will outlast us, bringing light, hope, and direction to those who follow in our footsteps, until we all return to that high and glorious place we once called home.